Hello guys and welcome back. With all the trade deadline shenanigans that we saw, it's really changed the playoff outlook this year and changed especially who the Stanley Cup favorites might be. So today I wanted to look at the rest of this regular season to see which teams ultimately make the playoffs, where each team is seated, and how that could affect the playoff race this year as we get into the playoff predictions and cup winner today. So make sure you watch till the end for all my playoff predictions and all of the Stanley Cup talk, and hit that subscribe button if you're new as we lead up to the trade deadline. The playoffs this year. Time flies. Now let's start out in the Pacific Division, which probably had the least amount of teams actually going for it at the deadline, making major moves or anything. Nobody really was crazy. I mean, Edmonton had a couple of moves with Trent Frederick and Jake Wallman, but nothing that I think is a massive needle mover compared to the Rantanen and Brad Marchand trades. In terms of the actual predictions, I think the Vegas Golden Knights by the end of things are going to end up winning it with 109 points, and pretty easily in my opinion. 4-game winning streak. They have a 6-point lead over the rest of the Pacific Division, and they're in a unique spot with their remaining schedule. In terms of the hardness scale among strength of schedules right now, Vegas is 30 out of 32, so technically the third easiest schedule the rest of the way. Next up, I have the Edmonton Oilers, who I see getting 98 points by the end of things. As of right now, they have 76 points, but they've been really inconsistent, especially since the Four Nations break, and they've had a couple of good games here and there, but haven't been able to string together that consistent success. The good thing for them is the strength of schedule is on their side. They're only a couple spots behind the Vegas Golden Knights in terms of the hardness scale, 28 out of 32, so a pretty easy schedule there. But considering one of their trade deadline acquisitions and Trent Frederick might not even be healthy for the rest of the regular season, he's not going to be much of a factor there. I have my doubts for Edmonton finishing off this regular season strong, but we'll see what happens in the playoffs, especially versus a team like LA that they always seem to play well against. But then we move on to the LA Kings, which is an unfortunate one for me. I see them finishing with 95 points on the year. I think it was a very easily capturable home ice advantage, but I just don't see them getting it. They've been really weird over the last few weeks. Also a team that hasn't been able to find that consistent success since the Four Nations. They have 71 points in 60 games, and I see them finishing with 95, about middle of the pack as well in terms of strength of schedule. So compared to Vegas and Edmonton, it's a lot harder going. But they're a team that I think really needed a major trade deadline addition. Andrei Kuzmenko is a fine offensive player, but not to me the type of caliber player that really is going to be a needle mover there for the Kings. I think that was a big disappointment for me that'll really translate in the regular season and the playoffs. Now let's move on to the Central Division. In first place, I'll have the Winnipeg Jets here. It isn't a no-brainer like it was maybe a couple of months ago, as we've seen the rest of the Central Division start to catch up here, but I do think just barely by a couple of points, the Jets will still get there. I mean, in terms of momentum, the Jets are right there. They already have 92 points in 64 games. Really, they just have to coast to the finish line, and they'll still likely get that first place spot, but we'll have to wait and see. I like their trade deadline additions, but when you factor in the strength of schedule, they have the 5th hardest schedule remaining, which is top among the Central Division. So we'll see if the Jets are able to hold on, but I think they'll be decent down the stretch, and with the cushion they've laid for themselves, that could be good enough to get to that first place spot. Next up, number 2, I have my Dallas Stars, and this is who I see really as the main competitor to that number 1 spot for the Jets. I do see them coming just a little bit shy of that with 111 points on the season. Most of this is due to injuries, Heiskanen likely not being back until the end of the regular season, as well as Mikko Rantanen, who had a little bit of a slow start with Carolina. I expect him to have a little bit of a slow start with Dallas as well, getting adjusted to that system, but overall, I think it will be okay, especially once he gets into the playoffs. For Dallas, I think they'll be in an all right spot, but again, I think the injuries might hold them back from truly competing there. But hey, a 4-game win streak, 7-2-1 over their last 10. We'll see how it goes over. But then we go on to number 3, which I think will pretty easily be the Colorado Avalanche. I don't know how far they're going to get, if they're going to actually be able to compete with the Stars and the Jets, just because of the position they're in. I mean, as of right now, the Stars have an 8-point cushion over the Avs. And even though the Colorado's done really well as of late, 4-game winning streak, the trade deadline additions that I think will be strong for them, I don't know if they're going to get quite there, but still a solid regular season for them and a good turnaround to end this season as they look, of course, to playoff success. Now we go on to the Western Conference wildcard race, and I think it's a debate once we get into number 2, but I don't think number 1 will be much of one. Even though Minnesota has had their inconsistencies the last little bit, they're going to pretty easily be that first wild card unless there's a spectacular collapse. They have 96 points and currently occupy that first wild card spot. The injuries there, of course, to Kaprizov do hurt, and you have the lackluster deadline, I would say, for them. But I think they're going to be fine to ride out this rest of the regular season, and even though I don't have much confidence in them in the playoffs, they're going to get there. But now we get into that second wildcard spot, which is all over the place. There are so many teams out there. You could have Vancouver, Calgary, St. Louis, even Utah. I could see making a potential push here, and Anaheim is also in there if they decided to go on a run there. There is so much balance to this race, just because not one team has really ever come out ahead and got that huge win streak that they needed to really solidify themselves. Everybody's kind of been in the same mid spot, and I think that will continue, honestly. But to me, I look at all these teams and I see who is playing the best, as well as who has the best strength of schedule going forward. And although it's not as clear cut as that, in this situation, there was really one team that pulled ahead. And to me, the second wildcard spot will be the St. Louis Blues, who I see finishing with 90 points on the year. A little bit of a surprise for some, but honestly, I don't think it really should be. Again, this conference race is wide open. It could go in any single direction. I can see Vancouver, of course, taking it in the end. But to me, I think St. Louis is just barely going to take advantage of it. In their last 10, the Blues are 7-2-1, which is a lot better than really every other team in this race. And you also look at the strength of schedule, and St. Louis, among 32 teams, has the easiest schedule remaining in the NHL. That is a massive factor, and you also consider the fact that they didn't really sell anything at this deadline, didn't make really any major trades. The same roster that is there, the same solid team is there, it's always been. They've just finally started to get it going, and now, with the team still there, I think the Blues are going to actually be able to capture that spot and just barely make it in. You could argue whether St. Louis should actually be trying to make the playoffs, whether they should have been a seller at the deadline, but I think every team will always take a roll of the dice, and for the Blues, even though I don't think they have the strongest chances, they're still in it. Now we move on to the Metro Division, which is kind of similar, I would say, to the Pacific, where there wasn't really any big moves from these contenders, at least to make them better, and I think that definitely helps the Washington Capitals, who really only made their moves go after Anthony Beauvillier, but when you look at the team, they didn't really need to make any major additions to me. The chemistry, the magic was all there. There was no reason to change that. And I see them finishing with 116 points on the year, and ultimately, I think, winning the President's Trophy this season. For Washington, they're still in a good spot. They're in a 3-game winning streak still. They have 90 points in 63 games. They also are just behind St. Louis for the second easiest schedule remaining in the NHL. So for Washington, it's already been easy. It's already been great. I think it's just going to continue to be. Another divisional spot that I don't think is all that much up for debate right now, and that is the Carolina Hurricanes. So I think we'll coast to 103 points on the season, playing very solid down the stretch. As of right now, they have 78 points in 63 games, but they're on a 3-game winning streak. They're starting to gain some momentum now. Even with the Mikko Rantanen saga, it's over now. They can look past that. They can finally be able to start gaining some momentum with the team they have now, and I think that is important as well. But now we go on to number 3, which I think is wide open at this point. I don't think there is any team that has a solidified spot in this race, but to me, the team that will just barely be able to capture this spot, I have the New York Rangers. Now, this is for a couple of reasons that I think the Rangers could get this spot. Personally, it's for a couple players here that needed to get hot that are starting to finally play well, like Mika Zibanejad, who has been a huge force for the Rangers recently. But they're 6-3-1 over the last 10, one of the hotter teams in the Eastern Conference. And even though I think the Adam Fox injury is going to be huge for them to see how that defense acclimates afterwards, I think they're going to be able to survive. We'll see what happens in the first round. I don't know if I love their chances, but at least they have a shot there. Now let's move on to the race for the division that I am most excited for, and that is the Atlantic. Ultimately, though, I see the Florida Panthers winning at number 1. But you have the Panthers, the Leafs, the Lightning, all fighting for that spot, and it could go either way, honestly. All those 3 teams have a strong chance at it, but I ultimately see Florida having the best shot. As of right now, they're 8-2-1 over their last 10, a 5-game winning streak. They're putting it together. Big trade deadline additions. Brad Marchand's going to be a monster down the stretch, and of course, in the playoffs as well. It's going to be a close race, but I give the Panthers the edge, and that is a big one, especially to get past that first round matchup of whoever's number 2 and number 3 in the Atlantic. It gives the Panthers a much easier shot, and I think, honestly, whoever comes out at that number 1 spot in the Atlantic is maybe a Stanley Cup favorite, at least out of the East. I think they have the strongest chance there. And of course, having the Panthers repeat, I mean, we could all see that happening. At number 2 in the Atlantic, though, I'm going to go with the Tampa Bay Lightning, who I think will just finish shy of Florida, a couple of points there at 103. They have been a team that has lit up the NHL as of late. In their last 10 games, they're 9-1-0. I think they're like 11-1-1 over their last 13 games, something like that. Vasilevsky has been an absolute monster. That team and the depth now that they have in Bjorkstrand and Gord, I think is going to be instrumental to their success. Tampa Bay, I think, is going to have a really dominant end to this season and will really pave the way to the playoffs as well, ultimately getting home ice advantage, which is going to be so important for that first round matchup. Which leads us on to number 3 and the Toronto Maple Leafs, who, like Tampa Bay before Florida, will just miss out on the spot by a couple of points, finishing with 101. I still see them having a decent end to the season, but I see just the overwhelming strength and hotness of Tampa especially being something that Toronto won't be able to match. Their trade deadline, I thought, was solid, getting players like Carlo, Laughton, big physical presences, but I think that will mostly translate for the playoffs. Regular season-wise, they'll be solid, but I don't think they're going to make an overwhelming impact for that Toronto team. We'll see what happens, but I think they're still in a solid spot. but ultimately losing that home ice advantage, I think, is going to be major for them. Now, let's move on to the Eastern Conference wildcard, a race that it feels like we've been talking about for the entire year. It has been so close, so tense all throughout, and of course, there only is 2 teams left that I think will end up making it. And unfortunately, there's going to be like 2-3 teams that are excellent quality hockey teams that are going to end up missing the playoffs because of this system. It is what it is, but now we have to decide the winners. And starting us off with the first wildcard spot in the Eastern Conference, I am going to go with the Ottawa Senators, finishing with 93 points on the year and not just missing out on an Atlantic Division spot, but being respectable in the Atlantic Division. I think for Ottawa, this is a serious time to go for it. I love their trade deadline additions in Dylan Cousins and Söderlund. Söderlund especially, I think will make an immediate impact. Cousins will have to wait and see if he's actually going to go back to his true form. But even if they don't, they still have the center options and players like Pinto who can carry that load if they really needed to. And I think for the Senators, they have their goaltender now. I think they're starting to shape up that chemistry. I would have liked to see them go after a defensive ad personally, but I think they're still in a good spot. And the big thing is their strength of schedule. With the Senators, among all NHL teams, they have the 4th easiest schedule remaining, which I think is huge for them. That cushion, I think, is going to be massive, especially in the Eastern Conference race, which has a lot of teams with really strong strength of schedules. Ottawa is going to have a much easier time, and I think that will ultimately be a big reason why they're able to get here. But now we go to the second wildcard position in the East, and this is one that I debated back and forth. I could honestly see this team missing the playoffs with how they're playing right now and the injury news they have, but I think just barely, I'm going to have the New Jersey Devils sneaking in with 91 points. I think this could come down to a point, maybe even a tie between teams like Columbus, Detroit, even the Montreal Canadiens with how they're playing right now. But I think the Devils are just barely going to get there. And it's not really for any one reason, because they haven't been playing well. Jack Hughes' injury is brutal news. And of course, you guys know how I felt about their trade deadline. Just completely no direction whatsoever with it, in my opinion. But I still like the base of that Devils team. I still like Jacob Markstrom, even though he's had his ups and downs. The injury news of Dougie Hamilton and Hughes really hurts. And honestly, if they are to miss the playoffs, I would not be surprised. I just think in terms of that cushion they built for themselves, it's a little bit more than other teams. And in this close Eastern Conference race, that's what I really see it coming down to. Plus, a big thing as well in terms of strength of schedule, the New Jersey Devils have the 6th easiest schedule going forward, which I think is massive. If they were up near the top, honestly, I would have maybe picked a team like Columbus or the Montreal Canadiens. But because they have an easier road than other teams, I think that is a massive factor. And honestly, with the injury news, they're going to need it. But now that sets up our first round matchups in the Western Conference, and we'll start out there. First, we got Winnipeg versus St. Louis as the #1 team in the Western Conference, facing off against the second wild card. Then we got the Central Division in Dallas versus Colorado. Oh my goodness, give me that every single day. Then you got Vegas versus Minnesota, #1 of the Pacific versus #1 wild card, and then Edmonton versus LA for the 1,000th straight time. Ultimately, I don't see any major upsets happening in this Western Conference. The biggest one I could maybe see is St. Louis with playoff Connor Hellebuck. Even though he was good in the Four Nations, we never know what's going to happen there. But I still see the Jets winning in 6. Dallas, Colorado is going to be an absolute classic no matter how it goes, though I do see the Stars winning in 7 eventually, just because of the forward depth there making a massive difference to me. Then you got Vegas versus Minnesota, and as much as I'd like to say the Wild could come out and have an upset, I just don't think the team's going to be healthy enough or really strong depth-wise enough to really match up against the Golden Knights. And I see the Vegas winning in 5. And then Edmonton versus LA, where the Oilers are going to win again because it's Oilers versus Kings of the playoffs. And that's just how it goes. But then we go into the Eastern Conference, which to me has so many more interesting first-round matchups. First, you got Washington versus New Jersey. I mean, Washington has had a great year, but, you know, the playoff experience, not the playoff experience, but the playoff pedigree hasn't really been there as of late. You got a New Jersey Devils team that is all over the place in shambles right now, but maybe they're able to come up with something. You got Carolina versus New York, a matchup multiple times here would be awesome to see, especially with how the Rangers are resurging. Maybe that could be an interesting matchup there. You got Florida versus Ottawa. Oh my goodness gracious, this would be so much fun. I don't know how much I would give the Sens in terms of actual chances in this series, but Brady versus Matthew, the intensity of the series would just be so much fun to watch. Ottawa finally making the playoffs. The Canadian Tire Center finally getting playoff hockey for the first time in forever. That would be electric. And then Tampa Bay versus Toronto. Speaking of electric, man, that would be a bloodbath. So much fun. The trade deadline editions, so much more physicality. I need to see it right now. As for the actual results here, I think Washington's going to take over New Jersey in that series. I just think the Devils have too many holes with their injuries, and it's not going to come together in the right way. Carolina versus New York. This is my first upset of the video. I think the Rangers end up taking it in 7. I think Igor Shesterkin is going to have a massive playoff series here. And I think with Carolina, you look at the team and you look at the lack of finishing that I think is going to happen there. Gensel already last year was such a major component, and they still couldn't get over that hump. Now they don't have a player like that. They don't even have Mikko Rantanen anymore. And I love Logan Stankoven, but he's not going to be that playoff clutch goal scorer that they need. In fact, I think it's going to be a little bit of an opposite case where the shooting just isn't quite there. I think the Rangers are eventually going to take that series and have a little bit of an upset and try to change the tide of that whole franchise. Then you got Florida versus Ottawa, and I think the Sens are going to put up a good fight. They're going to get there in the playoffs, get some experience, but compared to a team like Florida that has the playoff experience, has the pedigree, and is still at a major level, you could argue has a better roster than they did last year, and I just don't see the Sens standing a chance late in that series, sadly, but it's just the way it goes, and the Sens getting that playoff experience is huge for them. Then we got Tampa versus Toronto, and I think this could go either way, but in my opinion, I think it really just comes down to that home ice advantage. That to me, I think is just such an advantage in this series specifically, especially for a team like the Leafs. I think they could really, really use it. But I think for Tampa Bay, how hot they've been, I think is going to be a major factor. Though, the last time we saw Leafs Lightning, the Vasilevsky performance wasn't what you wanted to see. So that's something to watch for me. If Vasilevsky can't play well against the Leafs again, I could see it going the Leafs' way. But I think with how hot he's been going into this playoffs, I think it'll be a little bit different. Now we move on to the second round, which has banger after banger matchup. First is Winnipeg Jets versus the Dallas Stars, Knights versus Oilers, Caps versus Rangers, and of course, the Battle of Florida yet again in the second round. And now for my playoff predictions here. First, I got Winnipeg versus Dallas, and again, it could go either way here. Personally, though, I see the edge going to the Stars, mostly because of the forward pop that the Dallas Stars have, especially at 5-on-5, I think is a pretty clear difference. Though, again, you can't count out the depth and the defensive structure. The Jets have solidified that for themselves. And, of course, the best goaltender in the world, Connor Hellebuyck. So, I think it could go either way. But, personally, I think the Stars are going to be able to get that series done. Then you got Vegas versus Edmonton. And I think this playoff series is going to be going the Golden Knights' way completely. I see the Oilers' goaltending crumbling here. Stuart Skinner has not really had the consistency he even had last year. And I think that is a massive factor. They've really added on to their defensive issues, going after another offensive defenseman. John Klingberg is going to be completely lit up. I don't really have much faith in that defense coming together for the Oilers, and I think the Knights will end up really just picking it apart as the series goes on. Then we have Washington versus New York, and I was kind of tempted to go the Rangers' way in this, but even though I think they'll have a pretty big upset versus Carolina, I don't think that magic is going to continue. I think the Caps, with their depth, with just how strong they've been top to bottom, will continue to be in the playoffs and just barely get past the Rangers, but that home ice advantage also being a pretty big factor. Then we go on to Florida versus Tampa Bay, though, and this, again, either way, so many amazing players, so many amazing additions from this year's deadline. You have Seth Jones, you have Brad Marchand for the Panthers side, you have the big Bjorkstrand and Yanni Gourde deal for Tampa Bay, but I see the Lightning just being able to capture it. Again, I think the hotness going in the playoffs will be a major factor here, but the big difference I see is the goaltending. Even though Bobrovsky is still good, Vasilevsky has been great. And I think he will be elite in this year's playoffs. I think he's ready to make some major damage, really put a playoff performance together that he hasn't in a while, and show himself and prove himself again. And I think the depth as well for Tampa Bay. That was always the main issue for me. Now they've really solidified it a lot more and made it a lot stronger top to bottom. Plus, you still have the dynamic players of Kucherov, Brighton Point, Jake Gensel, firing the best they've ever done. And I think that's going to be a major factor as well as they dominate their way through these year's playoffs and not dominate versus Florida, but do extremely well. But then we go into the illustrious conference finals. In the West, it will be Dallas versus Vegas for an epic matchup there. Then we have Washington versus Tampa Bay in the East, and this would also be so much fun. I mean, we have two matchups that have been done so many times, but the rivalry there has been so solidified already. I think in both cases, it would be magical series, and I think it's going to go down a very specific way. Ultimately, in the conference finals, I think the Stars are going to win in 6 versus Vegas. I think they're going to have a little bit of an edge in terms of their forward scoring, in terms of the top end play, especially matching up versus Jack Eichel, who I think is really the only major piece for that Vegas team that is firing on all cylinders right now. I think Dallas is just going to have so much more of a broader top 6. I think that power play is going to be huge as well for the Stars as it gets going, hopefully, in this second half. I think the goaltending is also going to be a major factor. If Ottinger can string together finally a consistent playoff run, I think he could be a massive difference there. I still have worries about the Stars defense, But ultimately, I think it'll be fine versus Vegas, and I think they're going to move on to the Stanley Cup final. And then in the Eastern Conference, I have Washington versus Tampa Bay, and I think this is where the Caps' magic starts to run out a little bit, especially when you look at the top-end scorers there and players like McMichael, Dylan Strome. They're relatively inexperienced in the playoffs, at least playing major roles. And I think this is where it's really going to show as Tampa Bay wins in 5. Just a clear difference in terms of the playoff experience, the clutchness there already that's been proven with Tampa Bay. And I think the goaltending is going to be a big thing here too. Logan Thompson is somebody that also hasn't been able to prove himself as a full-time playoff starter yet. In Washington, maybe that happens this year, and I think he'll be good in the first couple rounds, but I think it's going to be a clear difference once he faces Andre Vasilevsky, who I think is going to be an X factor all throughout the year. But that, of course, sets up a Stanley Cup final, a rematch of the 2020 Stanley Cup finals in Dallas versus Tampa Bay. And this would be so much fun to watch. Two of my favorite teams out there dueling out yet again. And I think this would be just an absolute classic. In fact, I think you can make the case that this is a way stronger matchup than both of these teams were back in 2020. They've just locked in so completely with their rosters and with their runs. I think the goaltending is going to be a massive thing heading into this series. The power plays are going to be dynamic. Just so many great storylines. Overall, though, I see it going similarly to how we saw it going in 2020. I think the Tampa Bay Lightning will win in 6 games. A lot of this, I think, will come down to the Stars' iffy right side on the defense. And I think for the Stars as well, finding that extra gear in the playoffs has been a little bit of an issue at times, especially when the clutch scoring is needed. And I think the goaltending difference will still be there. Even though I think Andre is going to have a great run, I think Andre Vasilevsky is going to win himself the Conn Smythe this year and be just solidifying his legacy in a complete way, winning his 3rd Stanley Cup and being really a major part of it. And really the Kucherovs, the Braden Points, I think they're going to have a massive playoff run. Brandon Hagel, I think, is going to be unbelievable in this series especially, and Tampa Bay is going to end up winning it. Unfortunately for me, but it is what it is. I've come to expect it. But those are my playoff predictions and full predictions for the standings as well for this 2025 season the rest of the way. And I hope you guys did enjoy. Of course, if I didn't predict your team, okay, sorry. One team had to win, and even though I predicted Tampa Bay, it could be all over the place. This is such a balanced group of contenders and teams that can make the playoffs. It's a completely wide open race. So if you disagree with me, that's completely fine. Just let me know your thoughts in the comments down below on what you guys think is going to happen, which teams do you see making the playoffs, and who do you see winning the Stanley Cup as well. Let me know all your thoughts. Of course, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell if you guys enjoyed the breakdowns and want to see more like this, and in the future as well, or in the future, make sure you share it with all the hockey fans you guys know online, and click on this card for all my predictions content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, and I hope you have a fantastic hockey day. Goodbye.